you ever hurt somebody without knowing that you did it in the moment? Perhaps an unkind word or a thoughtless act. I'm sure we've all been there. And on those occasions, how did you come to know that you'd caused offence? Now, I'm sure there are a number of scenarios or situations where we just will never find out that we've hurt somebody. But the times that we do find out, I think it's probably because the person we've hurt comes and tells us. They move towards us, they explain what went wrong, and they seek reconciliation. Similarly, in Exodus 27, we meet God showing his people that they have offended him, and then creating a way to be reconciled. Remember, everything about the tabernacle and its court is meant to illustrate something of who God is and what relationship with him is like. Through the ark, he revealed the intimacy of his plan to dwell with his people. Through the table of the bread of the presence, he revealed his caring provision. Through the lampstand, he showed that true life and light radiate from God alone. And through the tent, he illustrated heaven and earth meeting in his plan to come and live among his people. And so the altar and the court represent something too, namely that people have offended God and that he has made a way to be reconciled. Another way to put this could be that in the altar and the court we see humanity's need of forgiveness and God's provision of that forgiveness. How do the altar and the court represent this then? Well, a number of psalms show us what Israel thought of the court. When we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave our transgressions. Blessed are those who you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. That's Psalm 65, 3-4. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Psalm 84, verse 2. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. Psalm 84:10. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. Psalm 100:4. So in these verses we see deep visceral need met and satisfied in God's presence, leading to great rejoicing. Why is that? Well, in Psalm 65, we saw the answer. When we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave our transgressions. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. Needy people came to God and found freedom, forgiveness. Israel loved the presence of the Lord that they saw in the courts because there they found they could be forgiven. And that makes sense of the altar in the courtyard. This was the place for general, individual and corporate sin to be atoned for. Fellowship to be restored as per the instructions in Leviticus 1-5. This was the place for Israel to come to be made right with God and with one another. But among those offerings, Leviticus 2 also calls for grain offerings, so for thanksgiving for God's provision. You see, for the Israelite, the altar and the court were the epicenter of relationship with God. They could always seek forgiveness. They could always give praise in his court. So here we see, first, humanity's need of forgiveness, and second, God's provision of forgiveness. Let's look at the first, humanity's need of forgiveness. If Israel could find forgiveness in God's court, then that means they needed forgiveness. This has been shown to us for some chapters. Back in chapter 20, as God gave the law, he also gave the ordinance of altar building. Then, after giving the application of the law to daily Israelite life in Exodus 21-23, God and Israel affirmed their covenant relationship. Israel becoming God's holy people with the sacrifice of burnt offerings and peace offerings. So, if Israel needed forgiveness, what did they need forgiveness for? what had they done? And we see the instructions to build an altar and the offerings of Exodus 24, they each come after God explains the law to Israel. As God reveals what holy living looks like, loving God with our whole beings and loving our neighbours as though they were us, ourselves, provision is made for failing to meet this standard. God's people need forgiveness for failing to be holy, failing to love him and to love one another as they should. This is because holiness is not some extra niceness, it's not some optional goodness that some people subscribe to. Rather, holiness is essentially pure goodness. It is unadulterated goodness, unfiltered goodness. We see this as Psalm 15 asks, who can endure the perfect presence of the Lord? Starting at verse 1, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? And the answer in verse 2, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honours those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, who does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. Psalm 15 tells us that the standard for holiness is high. So it's not just to be good, it's to be blameless. To do what is righteous. To speak the truth just naturally from our hearts. And the list goes on. And so, to not be holy, to not be this pattern of person in our hearts, is to be less than true goodness, to be less than really good. It's to be evil. It's to commit sin. And sin is an offence, the capital offence against the Creator God. It is a capital offence which requires punishment to be righted. This leads us to the second thing the altar and the courtyard show us. Israel could find forgiveness in God's court because God provides a means of forgiveness. You see, the offerings of Exodus 24 recognise the culpability, the offence committed by every Israelite. They paint the picture of the offences committed by every person. And in Exodus 24, they atoned for Israel's failure to live as God's holy people. The offerings meant that the punishment due for their sin was paid for. Justice was done. God could forgive them, and they could enter into the new covenant relationship. Peace was restored, and they enjoyed a fellowship meal. The eating of the parts of the sacrifice as a meal with God. You see, in his law, God showed the standards of holy living, yet he also provided a means of forgiveness, not because his law was faulty, but because he knew that Israel would break it. Now this may make us wonder why God knew, or why he didn't give them a better law, one they could perhaps keep. Paul tells us that the law shines a spotlight on human sinfulness. You see, sin is rebellion against God. It's not just a crime, it is an act of rebellion, of rejection, brought about by Adam and Eve's rebellion in Genesis 3. The law shows us godly living, and in doing so reveals our desire to reject our Creator. The law applied in Exodus 21 to 23 show us the nature of a godly heart, and in doing so it reveals just how far we are from that. The nature of the godly heart is summarised in Luke as love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind. and love your neighbour as yourself. I know I certainly don't love God that way all the time. And I definitely don't love the people around me the way I love myself. Do you? If you don't, when you don't, you, like me, like everybody, sins. And that is the natural posture of our heart. Just think back to Psalm 15. Can any of us say that we're blameless? Can any of us say we've not slandered another? Or that we've not gone against our word when it's been to our interests not to? If we're honest, what comes genuinely from our hearts is self-interest, a desire for entertainment, a proud certainty of our intellectual superiority, a longing for personal satisfaction and gain. The list goes on. But they don't amount to what God is talking about. Only a Psalm 15 sort of person can live in God's presence. The altar and the court showed Israel then and us now that we're deeply in need of God's forgiveness for not living as we should. And though God would be within his rights to refuse forgiveness, the altar and the court shows that even in Exodus 27, God was willing to provide a way for his people, for all people, to be reconciled to him. He is not the spurned, pouting deity some like to paint him as, but rather the creator of the universe who has been incomprehensibly offended by human sin, and yet chooses to reach out to offer us a way back into relationship with him. I'm sure we've all been in the situation where, having been hurt by somebody ourselves, we no longer want anything to do with them. We decide to protect ourselves by maintaining a distance. We build up an anger, a hatred because of things left unsaid. And quite unlike that situation, God has done the work to fix that which has been broken between us and him. So what should we make of the altar and the court now? Put another way, if somebody came to us and explained how we'd genuinely hurt them in some way and reached out to make things right, what should we do? What would we do? So as we look at the altar and the court, we've been given the symbol. We've been shown our sinfulness, our crimes against God, and the way to be made right. Like the Israelites back in Exodus, we now have two choices. Do we sit in our tent, refusing to meet with the reconciling God, the one who made us? Or do we move towards him? Enter the gate of his court on his terms. Meet his right wrath towards our sin with the offering he has prepared for us in Jesus. The one thing that neither Israel nor we can do is remain neutral. I thank you for watching this video. I hope you found something here helpful or useful. If you did, do leave a like. If you've got some thoughts or some questions, I'd love to see them in the comments. I'd love to engage and help continue conversation where possible. If you'd like to keep up to date, I release every Sunday at the moment. So do subscribe if you'd like to be notified of new things coming out. I look forward to looking at Exodus 28 and the institution of the priesthood and what that means for us.